Hello and welcome to this webinar today. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21, and this is one of the many webinars we do where we look at some of the big issues in our present century, and we cover a wide area of interests. And today we've got Roger McKenzie with us. Now, Roger is an active trade unionist, and he'll tell you more about that as we go along. And we're going to talk about racism, and particularly structural racism today, which is a problem that is faced in many, many countries. And we've seen that when the demonstrations took place around the tragic death of George Floyd. So Roger, thank you for joining us today. And
You're welcome.
You know, it's great to have you here on this webinar. So can I ask you, first of all, if you could tell people a little about yourself and your background? Sure, people in your union, which is Unison, the biggest union in the country, I know they will know you, but a lot of people may not. So maybe you could tell us just a little about yourself.
Sure, and thanks for having me on the webinar. I'm currently Assistant General Secretary, one of the Assistant General Secretaries of Unison. I'm responsible for organising and recruitment and all the unions' education programmes for members and activists. I have been a long time anti-racist campaigner. And not just a campaigner, I think an organiser against racism, which is, I think, an important distinction to make, something I've done all my life within the trade union movement and within the Labour Party, where I was one of the leaders of the Labour Party black sections for some years. I'm originally from Walsall in the West Midlands, I've been an active trade unionist from the day that I left work, day that I left school and started work, where I left school on the Friday and I was a subs collector for the union by the Monday afternoon on a building site. I remember on because we used to get paid cash in hand in those times, cash in hand, the envelopes, the actual envelopes, actual pay packets. And I remember going around on a Friday as the youngest and the blackest person on the building site, trying to collect subs off people and thinking that I knew all the abuse that I could have possibly heard and learned some new ones on that Friday. And I don't think I ever collected a single penny off anybody. But what I do remember is I collected lots of abuse and lots of bricks thrown at me and lots of tools thrown at me down on the building sites. And it kind of fitted into a lot of what I experienced when I was growing up in Walsall, which was sometimes having to fight my way into school, sometimes having to fight when we got to school, sometimes having to fight in the park down the road, having letter bombs thrown through our letterbox, having dog mess thrown through our letterbox, having the house vandalised, having the car outside vandalised. All of these things were just part of what we had to experience when we were growing up. So my experience of racism isn't theoretical. It's very real.
Let's go through some of those abuses in
Sure.
there, because I think we'll go through quite a lot of that. But as far as trade unions go, I'm old enough to remember when trade unionists marched in favour of Enoch Powell's blood of speech, a speech which he made some time ago now. People were shocked then. Do you think trade unions have now sort of brass and nettle about racism, or is there still a lot of work to do?
I think you have to draw a distinction between what trade unions say and what the policies are and what actually happens on the ground in workplaces, because any black person will be able to tell you who's in the workplace that there's so many examples of abuse that many of us would have had, that I've had over the years, from people who call themselves trade unionists. It's not just about people marching in favour of somebody like Powell all those years ago, was it 68? But it's also about some of the things that we experience, the institutional racism that is quite often, sometimes negotiated by some trade unions, it has to be said, that we've had to endure. So they negotiate procedures for people to be able to be promoted, to be appointed into workplaces, and so many examples of where that's played against black people. So that real systemic racism just doesn't come out of the blue. It comes out of it comes out of policies and procedures which have often been negotiated by trade unions. So some trade unions have made real good strides as institutions, and are really, you will see them on marches and all the rest of it. But still, what we see is too many trade unionists who are giving black people abuse in workplaces, or too many trade unionists who are still actually marching against things like when we say Black Lives Matter. They are marching to say, well, all lives matter, and why are you saying that sort of stuff?
So I gather you want to stand as a candidate for the General Secretary.
Yeah, I'm standing.
You are standing, okay. Yeah. And if you get it, would be your aim to make sure that trade unions are champions of anti-racism and supporters of minorities?
Yeah, absolutely, because that's where we should be. Because there's too much made, I think, of there's too much rhetoric about what trade unionism is and what it isn't. I mean, for me, it's about empowering workers in the workplace. If you empower workers in the workplace, part of that empowerment is understanding that one group of workers isn't about to try and outdo another group of workers, whether it's the colour of someone's skin, or whether it's someone's gender or sexuality or age or whatever. It's not about that. It's about workers coming together. So my campaign for General Secretary, but frankly, what I have done all my life as a trade unionist, all my life as a socialist, actually, is to argue that we are stronger when we're together. If we're all together now as working people, we have a much stronger chance of being able to stand up against some of the things that, and some of these employers, some of the things they get up to is outrageous, deliberately setting against each other. They deliberately do it, and you see it day in and day out. And the only way we can defeat those things if we stick together as working people, black and white.
We're looking at some of the things that you have to defeat in modern day Britain. I mean, you're on record as saying that people in public services, black people particularly, and migrants, suffer a huge amount of abuse. Can you tell us how widespread you think that is?
Oh, I think the abuse that we face comes in lots of different ways. Some of it is much more obvious than others. So we will get the verbal abuse, the obvious verbal abuse still. That still does happen. You look at some of the absolutely disgraceful abuse that Diane Abbott gets, that Dawn Butler has got recently as well. Just some of the most disgusting stuff. But, in a sense, we know about that stuff, and we know that happens. We've had to already remove some comments from my campaign website, which are just racist, basically. We're having a debate about how much we publicise some of those things and whether that will encourage other people to come out with their racism. So that obvious stuff we know about, and we know it's going to happen. And it's sad in a way that you have to plan for that to happen. But the most difficult stuff, Francis, to deal with is the real kind of little insidious things, like when you're excluded from conversations, when you're excluded from meetings, and the little kind of side-eye stuff that takes place where, I've been black all my life. Well, no, actually, I was coloured for a little while. And then I decided that I was black. Right. But I've actually faced discrimination my whole life. So I recognize it in all its different ways. And you can tell what's happening. Sometimes it's much more difficult to explain it. And sometimes it's much more difficult to prove it. It's not as easy as the kind of blatant in your face kind of abuse and violence that we often face. But we know this stuff is happening, and sometimes what we say to people is that we know that you can see it too, but sometimes white folk take a decision not to stand with us and face it up, and that's one of the sad things about some of this.
When you said you were coloured for a while and then you were black, I understand that because I remember I was doing the BBC and I made a programme in Liverpool called Black and British, where I worked with the Liverpool community who've been, in Liverpool for generations.
I watched that. Yeah.
Did you watch that? Wow.
I did. Great programme.
And the idea of what you label yourself sometimes is trying to come to terms with white society, isn't it? How do they react to us? And being able to say I'm black and proud, that was an important moment.
Absolutely. It was so important to us that we reclaimed some pride. You know, one of the things that I think goes unwritten about in all of this is that I think there's an underestimation of the psychological kind of impact that racism has on us. You know this stuff is happening. It's going to happen. You kind of make a decision about where to go on holiday based on, are there any black people there? You make a decision on whether you're applying for a job at a certain place because you wonder, are there any black people there? Because it's really hard to be the first all the time when you're going into place. I've been the first black person in numerous trade union roles that I've done. In this role in my union now, Assistant General Secretary, I'm trying to be the first black General Secretary of the union. I've been the first black Regional Secretary of Unison. I was the first black Regional Secretary of the TUC. All of those things are great barriers to break down, but they're tough on you because everyone's watching you all the time. Everybody has an expectation, and you absolutely know that you are carrying the hopes and aspirations, but also you know that there's a whole load of people who are waiting to have a go at you at the first available opportunity. So you've got to get some pride from somewhere. You've got to be able to lift your head and carry yourself. And one of the ways that we did that when we were growing up, from my age group, was about asserting our blackness, was about saying to people, we are black and we are proud. And it was all through that kind of era of the kind of black power movement and the black pride movement that was taking place, where we were able to tap into a lot of that. And it wasn't just happening out of the United States, it was happening in the UK as well. So it's really important for us to have that sense of solidarity as well, because if I could add, Francis, one of the things about black in Britain, it's not the same as black in the US. For us here, it is a sense of unity between people of African and Asian descent. Now, that is not that doesn't play out the same way in the US or other places, but it was important for us because our shared history of colonialism that brought us together. And frankly, there was a lot of people, a lot of racists who were chasing us down in the streets who weren't making a distinction about whether we were Asian or whether we were Caribbean or African descent. We were all black to them as well.
In a way, because of that colonial tradition, many white people have been almost subconsciously sort of conditioned to a sort of white supremacist view without knowing it, and even liberals are. And I remember reading Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, where she has to go at liberals and says that very often they engage in token anti-racism. You know, they go on demonstrations, but if you look at the companies they're in, there are not many black people on the board. There are not many black people in management. And they say, I'm not anti-racist, but you know, those people aren't getting into places. So there is a sort of fragility about confronting their own prejudice, which very often is subconscious.
I think that's right. And I think one of the best books that I've read on all of this is a book by Professor Ibram X. Kendi called How to Be an Anti-Racist. I think it's a superb book. I'd recommend it to everybody, because also it's not just saying to white people that you have to be anti-racist. You can't just be non-racist. You have to be anti-racist. It's not just saying it to white people. It's saying it to black people too, that we have to examine our beliefs and about where we're coming from. And for me, that moves to an understanding that you don't beat racism with racism. You beat racism with solidarity. You beat racism with collectivism, with coming together as black and white people. That for me is critical to my whole political outlook and to my trade unionism, and for me what trade unions can bring to this whole thing. And I see too often that there's a reluctance amongst white people, but also a reluctance among some black people as well, to examine what it is that we're thinking. Because I think unless we're able to break through some of that stuff, you know, I mean, I know too many black people say, oh, I hate white people, you know, but and God knows there's a lot of justification sometimes maybe for that, but I also know a lot of white people who thoroughly hate black people, thoroughly, right? And what we have to do is break down this notion that this artificial thing called skin color, or race, which doesn't exist anyway, is any kind of real factor. What's being done here is that people are dividing us against each other. And we have to find a way of breaking through some of that stuff. And some of that's psychological, but some of it is what we are prepared to do to stand up for each other. What is it that we're prepared to do to challenge our own racism, but also to challenge racism when we see it in workplaces and in communities as well?
We challenge it, but from what you were saying, there are lots of misunderstandings and lack of knowledge. So is dialogue between races really important?
I think one of the things that's always bothered me is where people say, whatever you do, don't talk about race because it's so divisive, and they don't understand that actually it's still divisive. You're just not talking about it. And actually, what needs to happen is to challenge anything, you need to look at it, you need to examine it, you need to take it apart, you need to dissect it, and you need to understand where it's coming from, why it's been put in place, why it's being used the way that it is, why are some workers being treated less favourably than others, who benefits from that. And unless you can get to grips with that sort of stuff, well, you can't do that unless you talk about it, but it's no good just talking about it. We have to do something about it. I can't remember my English language now, but it's a doing word, whatever that is.
But I remember you saying in the interview you did with Kate Osmore that that it's not enough to go on the demonstrations. It's not enough to bend the knee and then go home. You've got to do something beyond that. And what you've got to do, surely, we talked about individual racism and abuse, but there's a deeper, more entrenched thing, and that's structural racism, isn't it? And what would you describe structural racism as being?
Well, I think it's those policies and procedures and laws that kind of are just so entrench discrimination, entrench inequality across workplaces and across wider society. Before the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry report, which obviously did so much to raise issues of around institutional racism. Many of us have been talking about those issues for years, and I remember one particular employer that I had contact with who threatened me with legal action at one point for saying that their organisation was behaving in a racist manner. Right, they absolutely threatened me with legal action. And then I remember when all the Stephen Lawrence stuff started to happen, and all the report came out, and the whole issue of institutional racism was much more to the fore. I remember looking at a local news program, and I saw this guy come up, and it was the same guy who threatened to take me to court or whatever, and saying, it was like taking the pledge, my institution is institutionally racist, as if it was the institution just did that itself, and nobody kind of was involved in doing that, in bringing those things about. My organisation is institutionally racist, like taking the AA pledge or something. So I gave him I got his number. I gave him a quick call, and he, as soon as he found out who it was, right, he just put the phone down and ran off, basically, because too many people jump on little bandwagons, and that's a little bit about what we saw recently. I know that there's politicians around now who were taking the knee for George Floyd, although they didn't for Ahmaud Arbery and they didn't for Breonna Taylor, but suddenly, because of how kind of obvious and how naked the murder of George Floyd was, people taking a knee and then going back into their workplaces and behaving in a racist way. Just think, come on, you have to actually challenge racism wherever you see it. One of the first things that I remember ever hearing about on a trade union course, it was where we used to have this workbook called the Tackling Racism at Work workbook, and it's a superb book that the TUC really needs to put out again. And I remember this one phrase. It says, "Dig where you stand." So you can go looking to have campaigns against racism thousands of miles away, if you like. And it is important to have solidarity with some of the racism that we see. When I was growing up, it was the campaign against apartheid and so on. It's really important to do that. But you also have to tackle the racism in your own backyard. You have to tackle the racism in your own workplaces. You have to tackle the racism within your own communities as well. And that's where it gets tough, because it is hard when you even tackle racism with your own family, right? When you have to challenge some of the behaviours and the comments of your own family. And you have to do that, though, if you're seriously calling yourself an anti-racist. The other thing I'd say to people, never, ever, ever say to me that you're colourblind. Never, right? Because I don't believe you. Right. And by the way, I've worked really hard for my 57 years trying to get people to recognize the color of my skin and the importance of the color of my skin and the heritage of that. But to try and use that as a way of not saying, well, I don't have to do anything against racism because I don't see color, is absolute nonsense. And people need to get away from that nonsense.
You know, that's the very point that Robin DiAngelo's making, that we're not colorblind. We all see color, even if the most liberal of people. We need to celebrate it, not pretend it's not there. I mean, it's quite interesting you saying, that institutions are made up of people. So you can't say that institutional racism is something out there. It's us, it's the people in it. So how do we tackle it? I mean, you must see it in employment practices, for example, as a trade unionist, that Black people particularly don't get the employment opportunities, even by anti-racist employers. What do you do about that?
Well, one of the things that I firmly support is the idea of more Black people being active within our trade unions. And that, number one, that means we're at the bargaining table, not being bargained about, but actually part of the bargaining process that takes place with employers. That's the first thing. But also more Black people involved in the trade union movement, at all levels, including senior levels within our organisations as well, so that we're engaging in that kind of debate, engaging with employers about the institutional racism that we can recognise that maybe others can't, but we're able to see it and to bring that to the attention of the rest of the organisation. The other thing, of course, is the importance of the trade union, not just leaving it to Black people to tackle racism, that the whole organisation needs to be thoroughly anti-racist. That it doesn't make excuses for things that happens where it underrepresents Black people, or whether it feels that it's able to put out photographs of trade unionists and there's no Black people on there, or is able to put out whole documents and there's no reference to anti-racism or no reference to Black people within it. We have to take this thing seriously. It has to be a particular role that is played by Black people, but it has to be a whole union approach to tackle racism. It's the only way it's going to get defeated. It's the only way it's actually going to get raised properly with employers, and it's the only way employers are going to treat it seriously when they see that the force of the trade union is that the trade union is organised in the workplace, and that the force of that trade union is going to ensure that the anti-racist policies are implemented by the employer.
If it's a whole trade union approach, it's also a whole society approach, isn't it?
Sure,
in that,
absolutely.
The sense that trade unionists have got to be interested not just in employment, but discrimination in housing, in the criminal justice system, and in education.
I couldn't agree more, and that's the sort of trade unionism that I believe in. It's literally cradle to the grave stuff, where we're not just looking at trade unionism as being only about paying rations in the workplace, vitally important as that is. We spend so much time at work, those of us who get jobs, that it's really important that that time that people are properly rewarded for what they do within the workplace, and that any kind of discrimination is rooted out. But it's also about the homes that our members live in. Still too much segregation in terms of, it's a postcode lottery, black communities and white communities in some parts of this country that never mix, never come together at all. And they don't even come together at school, don't even come together in communities. You see black and white football teams because they come from different parts of a town or city, and they come to play each other. I mean, some of those things have just got to be broken down. The services that are provided by local authorities, that are provided by a whole range of agencies. All of these things we have to be interested in, because our members don't just exist in the workplace, they exist in the wider community too. And we have to be interested in what happens to our members wherever they are.
And does it worry you? I mean, the death of George Floyd has brought the criminal justice system, in front of all of us globally. And yes, people who've never bent the knee have done it. Politicians have done it, and then probably sent their trousers to the dry cleaners afterwards. Yeah. The criminal justice system is a major area, isn't it, where so many black people disproportionately are in prison or suffer from it. Is that something you would take up as a trade unionist as well?
Yeah, well, we do take it up as trade unionists now. But what I always say is the most important thing is not just that you take it up, but you really want to see change. And then you have to say, well, how do you bring about real change? You bring about real change by having a strong trade union, by people joining their trade unions, by becoming active in their trade unions. For us in Unison, that is my whole campaign to be General Secretary, frankly, is that we have to have strong, powerful trade union that employers and the government and other agencies can't afford to ignore, because we are strong on the ground and people are playing an active role within the organization. So, for me, this is the vital thing. We have to be serious about change. We have to be serious about how we bring about real change. I've never met a politician that moves without somebody making them move. Never met one. And the only way we make them move, I think, is by bringing the voice of our 1.4 million members of Unison, and then the voice of the rest of the trade union movement to bear, to make sure that change happens.
Yeah, they often say politicians are behind society, and society leads and they follow. And I think that's a very real point. So, okay, supposing you get elected as General Secretary, when's the election, by the way?
Well, it's the nomination process is starting now, so it goes through till the end of the year. September time, we start the actual votes.
Okay, so supposing you come out victorious, I mean, what changes would you make to ensure that we have a future that's equal for everyone?
Well, as I've said, for me, the most vital thing is strong trade union movement, where people are engaged in that movement, people feel able to play an active role in that movement, that they're not just waiting for the knight in shining armor to come to their rescue in the shape of a full-time officer or something, or some official from somewhere, but actually they recognize the power that they've got within themselves and with their colleagues to make real change happen, to have real power within their workplace. So my campaign is all about building the level of activism within our union, increasing the membership of our union, but also looking at some of the things that we can do to bring the union closer to members, because people won't play an active role within their trade union if they see it as too remote. So what we're looking at is bringing more resources closer to the members, but also making sure that all the ways that members can play an active role within their union, and frankly, I have to say, this applies not just to Unison. As far as I can see, this applies to pretty much every trade union that I know of. We've got to find ways of making sure that people understand that the vehicle for change is within their own hands. It's not somebody else who's going to do this for us. We're on the brink of a massive recession, something that we haven't seen before. The only way for us to be able to come through that is by having a strong trade union movement that is part of a labour movement that is going to be able to deliver for working class people, and actually not be afraid to talk about class as well, and the importance of class as a way of and the class divides that already exist in this country that are being exacerbated by this government.
And are you optimistic about the future?
I'm always optimistic because I'm an organizer. I don't think you can be an organizer without being optimistic. I think one of the things that you do get as an organizer is that you get setbacks from time to time. Sometimes you don't get everything that you want. Sometimes people don't see your message, but you have to stay optimistic about the fact that if you bring people together and they can recognize the strength that they have in their collective, in solidarity together, that they can win. Because frankly, when you look back in history, you see in history, that's the only thing that has brought about real change, is when people have come together and seen that when they do come together, there is real power in that solidarity.
Okay, well, I like organising too, so now I know that's what makes me optimistic. I often wondered what it was, so that's what it is.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
Anyhow, I mean, we've sort of come to the end of it now, but if anybody wanted to know more about you, about what you do, about Unison, if they wanted to contact you, how would they go about doing that?
I'm all over. I'm all over Twitter. I'm all over social media. Of all kinds. Contact me at Unison, r.mckenzie@unison.co.uk. Really happy to try and help. If you work in public services, join Unison. If you got any doubts about whether you work in public services, contact Unison. You can join online. But most importantly, if you join Unison, play an active role, get involved in Unison. The Unison is its members. It's not about us as full-time officers. We're there to serve the members. So get involved, join in, and play an active role. And let's help build a movement that's going to bring about real change for working people, including Black people, because Black lives matters, because all lives should matter. But we've got so much experience that tells us that at the moment, Black lives don't matter enough to some people. So come and work with us and help us to make sure Black lives and therefore all lives matter.
Okay, well, thank you very much for doing that. I mean, it's a really interesting interview, and we could have gone on forever because there's so many issues and sort of tracks that we could have gone down. So it's been really interesting, and I think lots of people will find it, quite encouraging that you're very open about it, and encourage other people to be open about talking about differences, about race, about what makes us human, and that's really, really important. So thank you for joining us, and good luck in your, your contest for the General Secretaryship.
And can I thank you for what you're doing, because I think these webinars are really important. Thank you. I know you've been doing this for a few years now. So thank you for that, for keeping conversations going. We get nowhere without these conversations.
Oh, what makes them good is people like you coming on them, and we get so many people. So thank you again, and it's been a great interview. So we'll end this interview now.